Hello and welcome to this WithSecure webinar. My name is Janne Kauhanen and I'm joined today by Christine Beherasco, used to lead our TAC-Def department in WithSecure and F-Secure before that, and now she's our CISO. Matthew Rosenquist, CISO in his own right, but also you've got like 30 years of experience in this stuff, places including Intel, so you're a seasoned veteran of information security. And we're here today to talk about the NIST Cybersecurity Framework version 2. It's almost like a 10-year upgrade on the original framework, which was more like a pre-flight checklist, I would characterize it, a mechanism for improvement in organizations. But the version 2 aims to be a little bit more than that. It's got upgrades in it, great, but it is, I mean, it is more complex. It is a big pill to swallow. So maybe that's the topic we're here to talk about today is, how do we take this framework into use without it swallowing the whole company as a whole? So here are our guests and speakers today. And so without further ado, I guess the first question is what are the downsides of this? Like, what should we tell people to sort of watch out for when they wade into the Cybersecurity Framework version 2?
Well, I can take that one first. So I believe you already mentioned the first one. I mean, getting the organization swallowed as a whole, for instance. Because if you're the type of organization, for instance, that's just looking now at a framework that could help you out, I mean, NIST 2 has some really good things in it, but it can be quite big. And especially the new function govern, there's a lot about it that encompasses the different areas of the whole organization. So it becomes a question of where to begin, how do you approach it so that it doesn't become something bigger than what it should be. And it should serve your organization, not that your organization ends up serving the framework itself.
Yeah, so the framework was originally created for critical infrastructure. So it was originally intended for larger organizations, for governments, to understand how mature and whether they have a good grasp from a comprehensive and consistency perspective of their cyber risks. But the industry has needed it at all levels, and so it has evolved from just that government and critical infrastructure kind of sector to be a tool that can be used at any level. Small businesses, medium businesses, large companies, corporations, governments. It's a great tool, but like any good tool, you have to use it well. If you're not using it the way it should be, there can be some downsides, and that could be a detriment. It can draw away from the resources that you need to use elsewhere. So again, there needs to be a better understanding on its applicability, its use, where it fits correctly, and for every organization, they're the one that has to determine it. So there are some interesting challenges with both the previous framework as well as the current one.
So who's this for? Like, is it very labor-intensive, resource-hungry? Like, what size of a company do you need to be for this to be a benefit to you?
I think every company can benefit from this type of capability because, again, it gives you that insight to say, I need to look at all of these areas. Now, for a small company, it may just be looking a little bit, and some areas may not be as important as others. And for a larger organization, maybe with more threats, more risks, more assets, they need to take a much deeper approach, a more thorough approach to these different areas. But again, you got to see the big picture first before you can understand how you're going to apply it and how deep you're going to go down the rabbit hole.
It's actually pretty good if we take a look at this a little bit like a mirror, for instance, in an organization, and not something that is a prescription, that this is how exactly you should do it. Because as Matthew mentioned, different organizations have different needs. And at times, if we look at this, like a survey tool or a mirror that say, okay, these are the areas where it looks like we are already doing well, and these are the areas that there could still be some improvements, and this is an area where there's really a gaping hole, then you now know where are the areas that you could address first to get somewhere. But if it becomes a prescription tool, then it becomes sort of like a burden to the organization to comply with areas that maybe they don't really need that much.
Yeah, and you bring up a great point, because I like the mirror analogy. The NIST tool is about looking at yourself. It's about evaluating what you need and where you're at now and where you want to go. It's different than like an ISO certification or a SOC 2 certification where you're going to bring an outside party in to audit you, and it's their list that's important. In this case, it's really about you, your organization, what you feel is important, and that's how you use it typically for managing incremental changes in the direction you want to go. So it very much is a mirror. You're looking at yourself. It's not other organizations or other standards coming in and looking and evaluating you.
So what if you don't like what you see in the mirror? Like, is this going to be a stick for the boards to beat up the CISO with?
Well, first things first, you're the one looking at the mirror, not them. So,
right, okay.
Well, but jokes aside, I mean, there is a tendency, like as a CISO, that the boards would look at this as a checklist or could potentially ask you to, dare I say, benchmark your organization versus others when it comes to this. And as a mirror, this is not really the tool for that. Like as Matthew mentioned, this is about helping organizations, especially in the critical infrastructure at the beginning, to get somewhere where their security posture would be much better than where it is. But if you now start comparing your organization versus another and seeing that the calibrations that you actually look, you can't compare them 1:1 because you're evaluating them from different perspectives. So there's a tendency, there's a potential downside if it's going to be viewed that way. But if we keep to the mirror, if we keep to thinking about this as areas, where do I prioritize? How do I improve? Where are the areas where I should care more now versus the future? Then this can be a very helpful tool.
Okay.
Yeah, I would even go further and say it's a fatal mistake if you're going to be using your calculated results and try and compare it to another organization. Again, this is about what you feel is important, and another organization may measure that differently for their. So it's not an apples to apples comparison, unlike some of the other standards out there where, again, it's a standard checklist and they're going to go through things. So it's a fatal mistake if your board is going down that path to say, how do we compare? This is the wrong tool for that. There are other tools for that. But it's a great tool to say, okay, how have we improved in the areas we wanted to since the last time you came in?
Yes.
It's a great tool for that. Yeah. And that's where we see the big value. But if you're trying to compare to other organizations, it's a fatal mistake. Bad things will happen, guaranteed.
Right. So while we're still on the pitfalls, do they change based on your location, whether you're in the US or the EU or things like that?
To be honest, no. I mean, looking at the framework and thinking about the different subcategories, they are actually generic enough to be globally applicable. And from a cybersecurity perspective, dare I say the word that they are actually cyber common sense, essentially, that is distilled into different areas that you can take a look at in the context of your organization.
Yeah, so when you do figure out, okay, what's most applicable to me, you may have a recommendation for data security. Are you meeting regulatory compliance? Now, the regulatory, environment may be different, Europe to Asia to North America and so forth, but the framework itself is staying at that higher level of, are you compliant with, this is an area you need to look at. So the framework itself, I think it applies equally to all different regions. How you interpret it, that's going to be a little bit different based on where you operate and what other requirements there are that you're trying to meet.
Okay. We're going to do an audience poll right now. So the question is, are you planning to use Cybersecurity Framework version 2 in 2024? So are you going to be one of those early adopters of this? So the question is going to pop up here, and you can just click on your answer. We'll give you a bit of time to answer that. And I actually have an audience question that we can talk about while we wait. The question is this: I will be interested to hear what the panel thinks about Cybersecurity Framework 2 and how it can be applied to new European regulations like the NIST 2. So we're seeing more regulatory load on smaller companies in the EU and in the US. How can it help, especially if we need to comply in different regions?
Maybe I could take a first stab at that. I mean, some of the requirements in the new regulations that are coming in, for instance, in the European Union, there are stuff there related to vulnerabilities, related to security of your data at rest in transit that actually have specific subcategories in the NIST 2. So definitely it can be helpful. Now, I wouldn't map them 1:1, obviously. You need to look at the regulatory frameworks. But what is also stated in some of the subcategories in NIST 2 is exactly what Matthew said. There is a part there talking about the regulations in your area, which means that in so looking at the NIST 2, then you are then required as well to look at the different regulations where you operate at.
Okay. Shall we see what the poll says? 25% of the respondents say they are going to be using CSF2 in 2024, 14 and some are saying no, and undecided still 60. What do you guys think?
It's not surprising to me, right? You've got people that aren't currently using this type of maturity framework. So they have to decide, do I go to 1.1? Do I really want to jump into 2? I don't know if I even want anything. You've got people that are currently using version 1.1, and they have to decide, do I want to allocate the resources to migrate to version 2? Because there's a cost to it. There absolutely is a cost. And then you've got people that are, hey, I've decided I'm going to 2.0, but now I need to figure out how much effort am I going to allocate towards this? Because it can be a deep hole if you want it, or it can be shallow, depends on what your needs.
All right. Well, let's talk about some of the good things about this. I didn't give you a moment to answer the NIST 2 question, but is it good that this is coming out at the same time, or is it bad?
I think it's good. I like the update, right? 1.0 came out, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, somewhere around there.
Yeah. 2011.
1.1 then came out. We're seeing a fundamental change, an advancement, if you will, in what the framework is, and it's calling out specific things that are more relevant today than what they were. And a good example is third-party supply chain, those risks. The industry wasn't talking about it 9 years ago. It was important. We didn't know it was important. So now we know it's important. We know it's a growth area. The governance around all of that is very important. And so this model is reflecting that. Is it perfect in all ways? No, I'm sure we'll get into that. But the fact that it's calling out some of the more important things and things that maybe, I won't say neglected, but maybe we haven't efforted as much in the past, it brings attention to it. And I think that helps.
And to add to that, I actually like that it's a bit more modernized and attuned to the times. For instance, version 1.1 mentions about malicious code, but now threats are more generalized, because when it comes to threats, we're not just talking about malicious code. And when we're talking about data, then you protect it at rest, in transit, but now it's all about protecting it while you're doing the processing, because of course that's important as well. So it has definitely modernized even the language as well in the context of the technologies that we are also using today.
So I asked you guys earlier about whether this is a stick to beat the CISOs with, but turning that around, is this a way to sort of steer the conversations that board members are having with the CISOs? Is this sort of the common language and way to focus their attention on the right things?
Well, there are areas where it can help, but it can also become distracting. If I would be using this in a board, I would only be using this to measure where we are now versus where we were before. And I would definitely stop this from being used as a benchmark. And I would stop this from being used as a deep dive into individual details, because it can show, for instance, how we are changing our posture based on the organization's risk appetite and in our organization's context. But it shouldn't go beyond that in the context of the board.
Right. No, I was more talking about this framework covers specific areas. So would those be areas that you would try to talk to your board with, sort of cover all of them at some point and just, establish that common vocabulary?
Well, typically they would be interested a lot on the governance and how things have changed. But when I go now to the protect, detect, respond, I think I would lose them if I talk about details, because these are the areas that can get slightly technical, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the NIST framework there is a great tool for security leaders to understand these are potential areas that I do need to cover. But every audience is different. And the board is probably going to focus on the governance. That's a great place to discuss with the board. But a different audience, the CISO or whoever's the leader of security, they may want to go into more depth. But what it provides them is they see the bigger picture. These are potential areas that I do need to discuss. And whether it's at the highest level of identify or protect or a level or two down from that, it gives them a body, a breadth of topics that they should be covering or think about covering that's most pertinent to their organization. So instead of going in with the same slide deck with the board as you would with the customers or a supplier or frontline management, you realize, okay, there's different conversations you're going to have, but at least this covers that scope to be able to draw from. So I like it from that perspective.
All right. Let's do another poll. So the question is, has your board or C-suite raised any questions about this framework? Have they heard about it? Have they approached you as a security practitioner about the framework? So that's the poll. We have a couple of incoming questions about ISO 27001. So basically the question around this are worded a little bit differently, but basically the question is, if you're already applying that framework, is it necessary to apply or even familiarize yourself with the cybersecurity framework too? Does it add anything? Does it bring anything new into the picture?
Well, the ISO 27001, a lot about it is about establishing your information security management in the organization, like your policies and implementation of that, and then getting audited for that. I would say that externally, it's a very good benchmark, but there's also a possibility. And of course, because you're audited in the context of the policies that you create. So there's also a tendency to optimize for those policies. And I hate to say it, but at times, I mean, of course, when different organizations optimize for those policies, it doesn't become a mirror anymore. It doesn't become an evaluation of the reality anymore on the ground. And
it's a picture you printed on your mirror.
Yes, and it's a picture that you show externally.
Exactly.
So the beauty of having the NIST 2 and having this as an internal tool to look into yourself is that I believe that it gives you a very honest evaluation of yourself if you use it as such. And the ISO 27001 is then an external validation of the areas that, based on your policies, then the auditors are able to validate.
Right. Does that make sense to you?
It absolutely does, right? When you look at the ISO standards or SOC 2 standards or whatnot, you're looking from the outside in, and that's very important, and it can be very, very prescriptive. When you're using the NIST CSF, it's that internal, let me look at my mirror, and the emphasis that you're going to place on it is what's most relevant to me. That's where you start looking at the prioritization. When you're looking at the ISO, you're looking at more of a checklist. I need to get this done. It's all got to get done. Yes, yes, yes. But the NIST gives you a more personalized, potentially, if you're using it well, a more personalized introspective. And that may enable you to generate the right conversations, to get the right support, to be able to articulate strategically where you want to invest for the different audiences.
Okay. Let's see how our poll is doing. 65% no. So the powers that be are not approaching CISOs and security managers about the framework. Are we surprised?
Actually, I'm surprised
I'm
in the
surprised
12%.
I know. I was like, are they asking
What
already?
board member is going to be talking about this standard? I'm impressed, and you should be wary.
It became bigger now. It's like 12.41 now.
Maybe that's a reflection of boards are starting to get more savvy and more aware, which means their expectations for security are going up. If they're starting to talk about this standard,
at this stage,
it means, which is a good thing. I like this, that boards are becoming a little bit more savvy. They're thinking, I need to be more aware. Okay, what are some of these standards coming out? So if you're the CISO, you better get in front of this.
I know. But like, imagine if that's your board, then you probably shouldn't be in the audit committee for 20 minutes. You'll be there for an hour.
Yes.
Because they want to be dissecting this.
There's going to be more time.
Exactly.
But they're also going to have expectations that you're going to have to manage better. Because again, you don't want that question, well, how do we compare if that 12% or now 13% is saying, hey, we want to use this as a benchmark to compare against other. You need to kill that out early. And so manage them in understanding what the purpose is, how we're going to use it, and things of that sort.
Absolutely.
Manage that conversation.
So what about those companies where those conversations are not taking place right now? When this drops, is it going to surprise the C-suite? Are they going to be surprised?
I have a feeling they wouldn't be. I mean, the C-suite is very much used to new benchmarks and things coming in every now and then. So the question will most likely just cascade down to the CISOs. Then, like, you CISO, figure it out. What is it? Is it relevant for us? And what does it mean?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I do want to talk about recommendations and practical next steps, and I would like the audience to participate as well. So if you have any recommendations on how to approach this topic, please put them in the chat box, and we'll take a look at those. But you, what are your suggestions on how to, for example, implement this, how to implement the measurements that are in the framework?
Like how I typically approach this, because I've also looked at the version 1.1 previously with my team, and we turned this into a survey tool. So somebody technical engineering background, basically what we did was that we spread it out, the different subcategories into the different areas of the organization who knew about it, and who knew about our security posture, and then averaged sort of the implementation tier scoring, and then it became our mirror. My take on this is I would do the same. For next one, use this as a survey tool and see if there are stark differences or if there are areas where we have gaping holes. Because, I mean, I do like the different areas that it's tackling, and I would like to see where are the areas where we could be potentially weakest at, and then it matters to us. So that would be my practical next step.
Okay.
Yep.
And I would say there's a decision that has to be made. Right? You have to decide, do you even want to go? If you're using 1.1, for example, and you're managing your security risk really well, and you're doing your own internal governance, and everything is flowing very well, you've got all your metrics, everything's aligned, do you really need to go to version 2.0? Again, there's going to be a cost. There's an engineering cost. If you're going to use a vendor, it could create disruption that maybe you don't need right now. On the other hand, if you're using 1.1 and it isn't going so well, or you're not using anything at all, this may be a great opportunity because it may become more relevant for you. It may return a lot on that investment. But again, you have to take a look at the tool. It's not super prescriptive. Right? You get to decide how you're going to use it. You may tie it into, NIST 853 or 171 to get more prescriptive. But again, you need to do that assessment. It's worthwhile to take a look and see, are the deltas, right? That gaps that can be closed and covered. Can you use this to communicate better, to be able to show value, to be able to prioritize your resources, or maybe even justify some of that investment to that 12% of the boards that see this? There may be opportunities there, right? But you got to take a look at it. And it really should come from the cybersecurity leadership. See what opportunities are there.
So do we have practical advice on sort of how to have those conversations with the C-suite and get them on board?
Well, if you have done some surveys, and let's say, for example, your organization is in an area where potentially cybersecurity could be a competitive advantage, then that can be linked into conversations with the C-suite. And if you have already seen where are the areas that have gaping holes, and you'd like to seal those holes and use this framework as kind of like the initial guidance on how and where to start, then yeah, I think it can be a conversation starter.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the strengths here is the addition of the governance ring. Now, in reality, governance was always a part of cybersecurity management, but this specifically calls it out. And unfortunately, in the firefighting that we do every day, governance tends to be one of the last things we invest in. We have to put the fires out. That's what we have to do. So, establishing the governance and sustainable processes and making sure that over time it works and can be attested to, that tends to fall behind. So this may be an opportunity to bring that more to the forefront.
Yeah.
Because yes, firefighting is important, but cybersecurity doesn't get solved. It is a continual living process. So making sure that you're investing in that, which is what this new framework is in part trying to showcase, it's valuable. And being able to throw that slide up with your partners or maybe even your board to say, hey, this ring, this governance ring is something the industry says is important. We're weak in it. We want to grow in that space. And so we either need help or we're going to reallocate resources or we're going to prioritize. But that can drive that conversation and potentially gain the necessary support to achieve your goals in that space.
So, okay, for the CISOs out there who are getting started with this, should they sort of try to cover as much of it, get their hands around as much of it, of the framework, different sections in it, or should they just choose and sort of maybe dive deeper? What's the advice?
My take is start with, like in the govern function, there's an organizational context.
Yep.
And that would really be a very good place to start because it puts it in the context, well, technically, I mean, of the organization. And this would become a starting point for conversations, for instance, with the C-suite. And then they can then link it with what are the business outcomes that cybersecurity should be protecting, should be enabling, for instance. And if that is in place, then everything else, how to build a cybersecurity program, could then cascade from there. So if there's any recommendation on where to start, it would be to get that into place and have that agreed together with the executives in the organization.
I would go a different direction.
Go for it. Go for it. Go for it.
It's a strategic document, right? So if you're the CISO or security director and you're contemplating this, I would recommend, and I know it's not fun, but sit down and read the entire document. Understand how these different areas work together because they do interlock. They do cover each other. So you need to kind of understand, to see the value of it, you need to understand that strategic picture. And as you go through this, you're going to start making some kind of critical decisions of where are we strong, where are we weak, where should we invest, where shouldn't we? Should we tie this to a more prescriptive set of questions, like a NIST 853 or something of that sort? You're going to start to understand with your knowledge of your company and your risks where you can start seeing benefits and then how, and even if, this is the right framework for you. So I don't think you're going to see that just by looking at one section or just focusing. See the big picture first and then go forward.
Okay. So we've talked about how this is an internal tool. It's the mirror you use to look at yourself, focus inwards. So should we at some point sort of try to map this information with that external view, threat intelligence, things like that? Or is that just a separate exercise entirely?
Well, if we map, I mean, there are parts that can be mappable. And especially for areas like protect, detect, respond, that can even be easily mappable because they are sort of like less wider in scope. But there are also areas that they are more nuanced when it comes to like how you interpret them, and they need to be always interpreted in the context of where you're coming from. So I wouldn't say that they are fully mappable.
Okay.
Yeah, proceed with care. Because as soon as you start doing that, well, now people are going to want to compare you to other companies and things of that sort. So if you're going to do it, make sure you've got a reason why and understand that there are limitations there. So proceed carefully. You may create your own problems, especially if that 12% of the board goes, oh, so you've mapped it to, let's compare. Whoa, wait a second, that's not what it's intended for. Right, so be very clear.
And then you add the implementation tier numbering on top of that, and then you really have problems.
Oh, yeah. It compounds it.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about board members, stakeholders like that, but what about the wider organization, business in general? Sure, board members as well. Do we think that a framework like this will help a better understanding and sort of a better grasp on the cybersecurity risks?
I would say that especially when it comes to technical teams or technical leaders, I mean, this is a very good framework that is almost prescriptive because, I mean, they would see this as like, okay, we have this, we don't have this, do we need this? So that becomes like kind of like a very easy conversation. And there are also areas there, for instance, related to the human resources that are sort of like very specific and showing a specific area in the organization. So it definitely helps for conversation, but then when you start dissecting and diving deeper into the individual subcategories, it could potentially be confusing as well. So it's good to be careful depending on who is the audience that you're having conversations with on this one.
Yeah, I would say it's a good conversation starter, but every company is going to interpret it differently. So under the data security area, right, it's going to say something to the effect of one of the areas, sub-areas. It'll say, make sure you've got a risk assessment for your sensitive data. Okay. And one company may go, yes, we've got a risk assessment process, right? In fact, you may have two companies, let's say, that both say, yes, we've got a risk assessment process. And the first company might have a professional analyst that's looking at this and all these factors and doing qual to quant and graphs and awesome, super detailed. And they've checked yes, we do it. Well, the other company checked yes too. Well, we have a process. We flip a coin. It's a process. Well, those aren't equal. So yes, it's a conversation starter. You both have a process. Now tell me what that is.
So I guess the question then becomes, does this framework lead us, does it align us closer to the industry best practices? Does it give us clearer sort of cybersecurity baselines?
I would say it helps us avoid some common mistakes, right? It doesn't guarantee your security, right? You can interpret this the way you want. It doesn't mean you're going to be best in class. It's not something that you would use to compare to another company per se, but it helps you give more or receive more internal insight on where you're at and how you're progressing over time, because you're going to define your goals using this tool and you'll be able to see your progress. And that doesn't mean it's the same progress some other company's doing, or the end goal may be completely different, but that's okay. This is that internal view that you can use to manage yourself in the right direction. So you've got your vectors, you've got your goals, and you're going to try and get there.
Building on top of what Matthew said, as long as this tool is used not as a source of metrics on itself, but a guidance that, okay, these are the areas that you need to take a look at. But then the devil is still in the implementation details. That, okay, how do you implement it? I mean, as Matthew mentioned, if you flipped a coin in your implementation, that is not something that you can really properly measure how well you have improved your security posture, for instance, in that area. But if you use this as a source of initial information and then honestly look at your organization later on in the context of, okay, how do I improve continuously the security posture in this area, then yeah, it can be very helpful.
Okay. Is it intended to be, or should it be used as an inventory of sort of what you've invested in and sort of where there still remains work to be done?
Well, it can definitely show the areas where you have invested something in.
Yeah.
But it doesn't show areas that could potentially have bigger investments versus others.
Right.
Because it could also be that for one subcategory, you have multiple things underneath that contribute to that. So for instance, like one subcategory in governance could mean that you have touch points across the different areas of the organization, which is very broad, and it could take a while to implement, and it could be continuously costly to govern. But you have something, for example, in the recover area, which is just like you tick a box, and that's pretty much done. So it doesn't show the nuances of like this one has bigger investment versus the others, but it will show areas that, for example, you haven't really spent anything on this area versus another.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily translate to the meaningfulness of the controls that you're putting in place. It's more of these are the areas I want to work on, and I'm going to track that. It's, you know, and I know we're going to get to potentially some of the weaknesses, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to be optimally efficient in your resource allocation to reduce the overall risk. Yeah. There's no guarantee there, right? That comes back to your original decision of what you want to invest in. This is going to help you make sure you've got the broader picture and go, okay, I see where I could invest. Now I'm going to make a decision where to invest, and I can track that.
I got to take you up on your offer of weaknesses. I was sort of trying to cover those in the beginning and then move on to the positives, but was there something you felt that was left unsaid, a major weakness that you still want to cover?
Yeah, but let's get it from Christine first, because mine is, it's a pet peeve, and I'm going to rant on it.
Wow, okay.
So...
Well, okay.
Concerns?
Maybe one concern, because I am a big fan of secure by design, and in saying that, it's not just about building technologies, but the organization in general, that as a cybersecurity function, we are not really sustainable, and we do not scale if we are only an overlay for the organization. And there is a tendency to take a look at the framework, carry it as a cybersecurity function, and then implement it for the organization, and then just govern it from the CISO office, for instance. There is one area here, I mentioned human resources earlier, and this is one area where it touches other functions in the organization. But to be honest, I would have loved to see a little bit more of this, that the other areas of the organization, what does cybersecurity mean for them? Can we embed that? Because, for instance, I mean, there's finance. And, of course, there's a lot of cybersecurity-related threats when it comes to finance. Maybe it should be there as well. Maybe sales should be there as well, etc. So I think that's one area that, for future versions, I would wish could be a little bit more visible.
Okay. Matthew, you have your rant lined up.
See, she's very diplomatic about this. I'm less diplomatic. So I did give feedback on the original, the original 1.0 CSF, and I've given feedback on 1.1 and 2.0. The biggest area where I see there is a blind spot is, well, it goes back to this is a reflection of your internal security. And yet, so much of what we deal with, so much of our industry is driven by the intelligent adversaries that we have to deal with. There is very little in this framework that talks about that, that focuses on that. So by design, it's simply looking inwards at your internal controls, at what security programs you have and things of that sort. And to me, that's only half of the picture that we actually have to deal with, right? And, you know, the example, and we've talked about this before, right? If you are managing a football team, right, you can look at your players and you can see, well, you know, who's good players and what are our good plays and where are our strengths, where are our weaknesses? And you may even, for that championship game, look at, well, what's the condition of the field? Is it muddy? Is it wet? Is it cold? But if that's all you're looking at, you're probably missing out at one of the most important factors. Who are you playing against? What are their strengths? What are their go-to plays? And so if we're going to create a cybersecurity framework, it really should have a significant amount of focus on understanding and guiding security leadership to understand that adversary and having 1 or 2 lines in there that says, yeah, do a risk assessment on your threats.
There's some
That's it?
cyber threat intelligence.
That's it. That's all, out of all of this, you know? So I don't think that, I think it's missing. And I'm hoping when we get to 2.1 or 3.0, there's more emphasis in there. I think right now it currently resonates and caters to those technology-oriented type of CISOs that are really focused on internal controls. And that means the discussion that they have is about internal controls and not necessarily about the actual picture we need to deal with.
I want to challenge you a little bit on that because, you know, for the majority of the companies out there, their sort of main threat is the badness out there, like any kind of badness. They don't want any of it. And they don't have a very detailed attacker sort of profile that, you know, they're not worried about the state-sponsored actors, stuff like that. They just, you know, the ransomware, business email compromise, these basic things that are hitting them. So, you know, since they're going to be more or less the same for everyone, and for the ones that they're not the same, these guys probably, you know who they are and know what their threat model looks like. You know, what's the benefit of why don't we just put boilerplate in it?
So if you don't narrow down who your attackers are, and again, this was created for critical infrastructure, which means you have to worry about nation states,
Yeah.
but you also have to worry about data miners and cyber criminals and internal threats, disgruntled employees.
Yeah.
You've got to worry about the entire spectrum.
Yeah.
Whereas the smaller companies, okay, you may not need to worry about nation states. So I can start narrowing it down. If I don't narrow that down, what it means is I will have the emotional feel that I have to protect against everything.
Everything, yeah.
Okay, what, Frederick the Great, right? You try and protect everything, essentially you protect nothing.
Right.
And so if you can't narrow that down, you're going to try and spread out your resources too thin. You will never be successful.
True.
You have to align your efforts and resources where the most important threats are, the most likely attacks are. That's where you want to weight your defenses. Right? This isn't an IT problem where I need everything up and running the same and everything is going to be equal. This is more of a warfare combat problem where you need to weight against your front line, know where the enemy's coming in, know yourself, know your enemy, right?
Yeah.
Sun Tzu. But if you're only knowing yourself, you're not going to win. That's why Sun Tzu said, know yourself and know your enemy.
Yeah.
And right now, the framework, it doesn't focus on knowing your enemy.
Yeah.
And this is also why security is not really necessarily equal to cyber compliance. Because like with compliance, you can check all of these marks. But since you have spread yourself so thin,
Yeah.
there are areas that the attackers could get through. And maybe those are really the only areas that they're interested at in your organization.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, you didn't spend enough of your cybersecurity budget in making sure that this attack path, like this area, is actually the one that's a little bit more secure versus the others.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Very much so.
All right, I'm going to have to move us ahead to the questions and answers section so that we have time for some audience questions still. And wow, there are some good ones. How does this fit with the predict, prevent, detect, respond model that we already use successfully?
Well, I typically map predict to identify, but I guess now identify and govern have sort of, this is going to be fun. But yeah, that's how I typically would map it. So predict to identify, and now just govern is kind of like the encompassing thing behind the initial 5 functions. I don't know, what's your take on this?
I'm going to go back to my rant and say it doesn't really look at that prediction. Right? It's not designed to put focus or to drive conversations around that prediction of who my enemy is, what are the most likely methods that they're going to use, what is the most likely attacks, and how should I weight my defenses towards it. So again, I think it does great on the, how we're going to prevent and detect and respond to it, but that's a blind spot right there. And maybe 2.1, 3.0, when we get there, we'll have better conversations.
Okay. There are some CISOs out there certainly feeling the pain because I'm getting very typical CISO questions here. And for example, What areas of this framework are things that I could potentially outsource to managed service providers?
Ooh.
Oh, I mean, to be honest, I mean, my take is like the technical areas are easier to outsource.
Right.
I wouldn't outsource govern, identify, and recover. That's like all on you. But I wouldn't completely outsource the other functions as well. Like remember, if you need to be in control of your cybersecurity destiny in your organization, and therefore you can outsource some, but you need to have touch points. Like you need to have conversations with your managed security service provider. How do I look like now versus before? But obviously there are some there that can be quite prescriptive for them to deliver for you.
So what about you, Matthew? Would you run this as an external project?
Okay, so and again, I'm just going to build on what Christine said. If it's a leadership decision on what you should work on, your goals, your cybersecurity goals, which you absolutely have to have, right? That should stay in-house. That's something that some third-party vendor, they don't know your company, they don't know your market, they don't know how you're shifting and bending and your business goals there. So that needs to stay in-house. If there are certain projects, yes. If there's certain specialties that you don't have in-house, so we talked about the risk assessment. Anybody can implement a flip a coin risk assessment. If you want something more than that, if you want something top-notch, you're probably going to have to go out to a third-party vendor that knows really what that is. You may not have cloud security architects based on what you really need. You're probably going to have to outsource that technical, right? It's technical. And that's a great outsourcing thing. And operations. If you don't have an internal SOC, then you probably should be outsourcing that to be able to filter through all those so that you get good alerting and then you can respond and recover to situations. So there are opportunities, but when it comes to the strategic leadership and decision space, I think it has to stay in-house.
Yeah, you can't outsource your problems.
No, you can't.
Right, okay. So what about some of the signals? If there's a company out there who's already using the version 1.1, what are some of the signals that it's time for them now to move to 2.0?
Are there signals that it's time for you to move to 2.0?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, if, for example, the organization really wants to improve their governance and they're struggling for a place to start, and to really tell themselves afterwards and say that, okay, we have governance in place, this can actually be quite helpful because it shows you the different areas that you need to take a look at, and it gives you a very good place to start. So I think from that perspective, if 1.1 feels like the governance is all over the place, and it is because it's sprinkled all over the different places, then this could be very helpful, like to move towards this and make it a bit more organized from that perspective.
Yeah, I would say number one, I would agree with you. Number one is the governance space. If you're not currently feel comfortable and you think that that's an area that needs more attention, again, that 12% of the board already sees that new ring in there, and that's a great opportunity to say, hey, we need more investment here, we need to reallocate our resources, or we need to make a goal about governance. Another good one would be for third party, right? In the original and in 1.1, you don't talk a whole lot about third party risks. It's inferred there. But with 2.0, there's much more emphasis on that. So again, if that's a weak spot for you, yeah, move to the version 2.0 because it's calling it out. It's something you can point to. And when there's discussions at whatever level, whether it's the board or C-suite or functional line managers or whomever, you can pull out a recognized standard and see where it actually says third-party risk. Okay, great. It's not just the security person is crazy or paranoid. You actually have some justification that you can point to very easily.
Okay. What about the other side? Are there any sort of warning signs or signals that this might not be for you, version 2.0, or just like the framework in general? Like it might be too heavy for your organization or anything like that. Like how can you tell?
I mean, for example, if version 1.1 is working for your organization just fine, And if you believe that you already have the right kind of governances in place, I mean, for instance, many organizations already have ISO 27001, and then they have implemented version 1.1. There is really no urgency to say that, okay, now I need to go into 2.0 because it has come out. So it needs to go back into what does your organization need? I mean, what does the business need? And if you feel like you have some gaping holes, then yes, take a look. But if you don't, then maybe this is not yet the time to take a look at it. Because as Matthew mentioned earlier, this is an investment not just for the CISO function, but actually for the rest of the organization as well.
Yeah. I don't have anything more to add to that, right?
Okay,
if your current security is good, you're comfortable, it's getting you in the right direction, you're internally managing it already with priorities you like, why would you expend energy? Why would you take away momentum from that to implement something else?
Are there any sort of obligations or rules in this that, like, now that you're following this framework, you got to have 24/7 monitoring or anything like that?
No.
No? So it's just more of just like an assessment, how are you doing? Okay. What's the level of integration between the cybersecurity framework version 2 and SOX, if any?
I am not familiar, actually, with the level of integration. SOC 2.
Yeah, SOC 2.
Yeah.
SOC 2 Type 2.
Yeah.
Or even SOC 2 Type 1.
I mean, there are different areas that map out, but I haven't really looked at SOC 2 in parallel with NIST 2 yet, so I don't know if you have, Matthew.
So there is a difference. It's more SOC 2 or ISO certifications, it's much more prescriptive. So there are specific areas they're looking at. You know, do you have X policy? Do you have this? Do you have that? So when SOC 2, when they're supposed to come in and do this, they will look more at the details. Whereas the NSF is your opportunity to decide what you need. And you may not need certain things, or you may need, oh, I do need this policy, but I need much more in depth. I need to be very more specific in what procedures or guidelines are going to be in there. So they are used for two different things. And it's important. You may do both. You may do neither. But understand what the value is of those different tools. These are different tools in the toolbox. And one is more for its assurance to a third party, right? That's what SOC 2 is about. It's assurance to a third party that certain basic controls are in place. Okay. The NIST CSF is not that. It just isn't, right? It's an internal tool looking in the mirror saying, this is what we have, this is where we want to go, and that gives us our direction, our vectors, and potentially some priorities as part of the discussions we can now have. So they're different tools. Okay.
I can still tell that there's a lot of sort of concern among our audience about sort of, is this something that I should look into and something that I should implement in my organization? People are trying to approach this from different directions. There's a question, is there a size of an organization that is sort of the sweet spot or a cutoff point for this? Like, when do you embrace this framework? When do you sort of maybe stay out of it a little bit?
I mean, to be honest, it's general enough for anyone to take a look.
Any size of organization.
Yeah. But I mean, since this is not externally validated by auditors, then it can be interpreted within that organization's context as well. So, I mean, as Matthew mentioned, especially if you don't have any framework that you're working with, I mean, why not? Take a look at this, because I mean, there are things that you don't need to reinvent anymore. There are things there that are already laid out for you. But if your goal is to comply with every single thing, it also becomes a question of what for, because we do SOC 2 and we do ISO 27001 to show these things externally. And this should actually become something that is for you to take a look at where are the weakest things so that you can protect your organization. So this is really not for compliance sake.
Right.
So this is a tool for you to use and to start with. And it needs to be viewed differently as opposed to the externally visible certifications.
But that's the thing. I mean, we're talking about a subjective internal look, but it's also a guideline that will become legislation at some point. How does that work?
Yeah, but you got to get into the nuances, right? So if it does go into legislation, it'll be you should be following the NIST principles for it won't be real prescriptive, right?
Like do this or go to jail.
Right, but there may be some areas, right? So for example, for a government contract, they may go, okay, follow the standard, and we want the following controls in place.
Yeah.
But overall, I would advocate that everybody, whether you're going to adopt it or not, should at least read it and understand it.
Yeah.
And for a couple of reasons. One, just in reading it, you may realize there's an area that you had a blind spot in and go, wow, I didn't think about that. Let me go incorporate that. Maybe not in this framework, but let me go incorporate it into my program. The other aspect is, even if you don't adopt it, your suppliers, your vendors, your customers, your competitors may. And so when you're communicating with or about them, you need to at least understand that framework as you're having those conversations. So at least read it and understand it.
And I have one prediction on this one when you're talking about the customers, because I have a feeling that this is going to become part of the client due diligence questionnaires. And then this is like a copy of NIST 2, and then it's going to have question marks at the end of like different subcategories. Do you have this? Do you have that?
Right.
And that will come.
It will. And you better understand what the question is based on the framework.
And then you're going to realize that, okay, all of this is now coming from NIST 2, and my customers want it. Then that becomes kind of like a pressure point.
Because, again, we're talking about a tool for introspection. And I guess what I'm wondering is, the CISOs who are implementing this framework are going to have different agendas. Now, some might go in to sort of just take a look at where the organization is concentrating on. Some might be going in to justify spending. Some might be going in because they feel that at some point their clients are requiring that. Is that going to mean a difference in sort of how they approach the framework?
It could potentially be. Because, like with compliance, when you go into this framework as a confirmation to your potential customers or prospects that you have it, it can easily become a tick box as well. That, okay, I need to implement this because it's for customers. I have one implementation, even though it may be flipping a coin, tick. So there is a tendency to treat it like that.
Right.
And that would not be a very good use for the framework. Yeah.
I think it all comes back to the business goals.
Yeah.
Right. And once you understand what those are, they can change too, right? So you may have a certain set of cybersecurity business goals that you're attuning to and prioritizing, and then all of a sudden your customer base comes up and says, this is now important to us. And in order to be a competitive advantage, in order to actually get customers, this is now important. Well, that's probably going to change the corporate goals of what cybersecurity is now.
Indeed.
So now being compliant and having a story and publishing materials to show what we're doing with this model now becomes one of the cybersecurity goals. Okay.
Okay. Hey, with that, I want to thank you, Christine. Thank you, Matthew, for being with us today. And thank you for our audience for tuning in and engaging us with your excellent questions. Thank you, and be sure to check out our next webinar as well.